The rain comes down in sheets, a relentless curtain of water that has turned the alley behind the thrift shop into a treacherous river. Every step she takes is slow, careful. The hem of her worn cardigan soaked through, her knuckles white as they grip her umbrella. Her face, though lined with age, is determined, as if the weight of the years she's carried on her shoulders has finally led her here, to this moment. She squints through the downpour, eyes searching, until they fall on the fragile shape huddling near the dumpster. A small, shaking dog, its fur matted, its ribs showing through the dirt. A survivor, like her. She steps forward, and a gust of wind hits her face, the rain stinging her skin. But she doesn't stop. "Come on, little one." Her voice trembles, breaking the silence that had swallowed this forgotten alley. The dog lifts its head, eyes wide with fear, but there's something in her gaze that stops it from running. Her fingers, trembling more from the weight of her heart than the cold, stretch out toward it. The dog is terrified, but it comes closer, ever so slowly, as if it's not sure if it can trust her, or if it should let itself be rescued at all. The wind howls louder now, and she moves closer, drops of rain sliding down her cheeks. At this moment, the world seems to pause. In the chaos of the storm, two souls, so different yet so alike, find each other. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The rain had begun as a quiet drizzle, the kind that seems to promise nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. But as the evening deepened, so did the storm. It was the kind of rain that stings your skin, relentless and cold, as if the sky itself had become angry at the earth below. Eleanor stood in the small back room of her thrift shop, her fingers tracing the edges of a fraying coat hanging on a hook. It was the end of another long day. The shop had been quiet, as usual, and she had spent hours sorting through the donations. Old sweaters, chipped china, forgotten trinkets. Each one carried a history she would never know, a life she would never touch. She sighed, setting down the coat with a tired gesture, and walked to the front door. Her shop was small, tucked in between larger, more modern buildings, as if the city had long forgotten this little corner. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and old books, but Eleanor had grown accustomed to it. She had lived in this town for as long as she could remember, but now it felt more like a quiet exile. The world outside had continued to move forward, while she had remained in place, unseen, unnoticed, except by those who wandered into her store, seeking something cheap, something secondhand, a piece of the past to hold on to. The bell above the door jingled softly as Eleanor stepped outside, greeted by the immediate rush of cold air. She had lived alone since her husband's passing a few years back. She hadn't realized how much of the world she had let slip away until it was too late. She never used to notice the silence, not until it wrapped itself around her like a heavy blanket. But now, as the rain soaked through her cardigan, she could almost feel the weight of time pressing in on her. The sound of the rain was louder now, and the streets, once bustling, were emptying out. People rushed to their homes, avoiding the downpour. Eleanor pulled the collar of her coat up, shivering slightly as the wind picked up. She looked down at the alleyway beside the shop, a narrow strip of pavement that led into darkness. It wasn't much of an alley, just a forgotten space between two brick walls, lined with dumpsters and abandoned crates. It was a place people tended to avoid, a place that mirrored her life, a little too messy, a little too forgotten. She had often passed it, but tonight for some reason her feet turned toward it. She stepped cautiously into the alley, the rain now coming down in heavy sheets, the sound deafening against the concrete. The gutters were overflowing, turning the alley into a small, muddy river. Eleanor's shoes splashed as she moved forward, the cold creeping up her legs. She adjusted her umbrella, its fabric straining against the wind, and paused for a moment. The world felt oddly still here, despite the storm. It was as if the alley had its own secret, a world that belonged only to itself, away from the noise of the streets. That's when she heard it. A soft whimper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. It came from behind the dumpster, a sound so small and fragile that for a moment, Eleanor thought she might have imagined it. But then, it came again, a quiet, pitiful sound. Eleanor's heart jolted in her chest. She hesitated, unsure of what she was hearing, and then took a few tentative steps forward. There, crouching behind the dumpster, was a small, scraggly dog. Its fur was matted and filthy, and its ribs were visible beneath its thin coat. It looked up at her, eyes wide with fear, but there was something in those eyes, a raw, desperate look, that made Eleanor's heart twist. It was the kind of look that told a story without words, a story of abandonment, of survival, of a creature who had known nothing but loneliness. For a moment, Eleanor stood frozen. The rain soaked through her cardigan, her umbrella trembling in her hand. She wasn't sure what to do. She had never owned a dog. She had never been one to take in strays, and the thought of doing so now, at her age, with her health, with her quiet life, felt impossible. She barely had enough energy to run her shop, let alone care for an animal. Yet, as she stood there in the rain, staring at the frightened creature before her, something inside her shifted. She had never been the kind of woman to turn away from someone in need. Not in the years when she had been married, not when her husband had fallen ill, and not now, in the quiet after his passing. But this was different. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was a symbol of everything she had hidden from, everything she had avoided facing. She had spent so many years alone, so many years in the shadows, refusing to let anyone or anything get too close. It had been easier that way, easier to keep people at arm's length, to avoid the pain of loss. But now, as she looked into the dog's eyes, she felt a tug in her chest. She could see herself in this creature, lost, broken, looking for something to hold on to. And in that moment, she realized that the one thing she had been avoiding her entire life was the very thing that would bring her back to life. Connection. The dog needed her, just as much as she needed someone to care for. Her heart pounding, Eleanor knelt down, the wet ground seeping into her knees. She held out her hand, her fingers trembling, unsure of what to expect. The dog flinched, its body tensing, but it didn't run away. For a long moment, neither of them moved, as if they were both waiting for something. Finally, with a soft whine, the dog took a hesitant step forward, its body trembling as it sniffed the air around her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what made her do it, but she reached forward and gently brushed her fingers against its fur. The dog didn't pull away. It was cold, and its body was stiff with fear, but it didn't run. It simply stood there, allowing her to touch it. "Come on, little one," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking with something she couldn't quite name. "I won't hurt you." It took a few more seconds before the dog took a step closer, sniffing her hand cautiously. Eleanor's heart swelled with something new, a mixture of tenderness and protectiveness. She knew that this wasn't just a dog in need of food and shelter. This was a creature in need of something deeper, love, perhaps, or simply someone who wouldn't turn away. With a soft sigh, Eleanor scooped the dog into her arms, feeling the weight of its cold body against her chest. The rain soaked through her cardigan, but she didn't care. She wasn't thinking about the inconvenience or the mess or the practicalities of what this meant for her life. She was simply acting on something deeper, something more instinctual than anything she had ever known. The storm raged around her, but in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just her and the dog. They were alone together, in the rain-soaked alley, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt needed again. The quiet ache in her chest seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new warmth that spread through her as she held the dog close. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a beginning. And in the chaos of the storm, in the middle of the forgotten alley, Eleanor realized that she had just taken the first step toward a new chapter in her life. The walk back to Eleanor's house felt like an eternity. The dog, now gently cradled in her arms, was small and trembling, its body pressed tightly against her chest. She could feel its heart beating erratically, the fear still pulsing through its fragile form. It was a cold, sharp night, the kind that made the air feel like it was biting at the skin, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, racing between doubt and decision, between the overwhelming desire to help and the weight of what she was doing. As she walked through the alley, her footsteps echoing against the damp pavement, Eleanor found herself lost in the sound of the rain. It was a familiar rhythm, one she had grown used to during her years of solitude. It was easy to get lost in it. The gentle tap of water on the ground, the swoosh of tires speeding by in the distance. But tonight, it felt louder than usual, almost suffocating. Each drop against the pavement seemed to echo the pulse of uncertainty in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the weight of the dog in her arms, but her limbs felt heavier with every step. What was she doing? She had no plan, no idea how to care for an animal. Her life had been so carefully compartmentalized, small, predictable. The routine she had built around the store and the house was all she had known for years, and now, It was being thrown off balance by this fragile creature that was depending on her. She had lived her whole life avoiding commitment, avoiding emotional ties that could lead to heartache, loss, and, most of all, responsibility. She had been burned once, when her husband had passed, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her own grief. That pain had been enough to make her pull away from the world, to retreat into the quiet, where nothing could hurt her. But the dog was different. Its silent, pleading eyes, its tiny, cold body in her arms, it had shattered the barriers she had built. Now, it was forcing her to confront something she had buried for so long, the need to connect, to care for something other than herself. The storm raged around her, but inside, Eleanor was battling her own storm. She hadn't realized how much she longed for the feeling of being needed until now, until this dog, this scared, abandoned soul, had come into her life without warning. The journey to her home felt like a blur. She couldn't stop thinking about the weight of the dog, about the way it had hesitated, unsure of her touch, yet still trusting enough to inch closer. She had made the choice to bring it home with her, but now that she was here, she wondered if she was truly capable of caring for it. She had no experience, no guide to help her navigate this new territory. The dog wasn't just an animal. It was a reminder that she had been living alone, shut off from the world. And now, as the rain poured down around them, she realized she had let something in, something that might not be so easily contained. When Eleanor finally arrived home, she stepped into the warmth of her small living room. The house smelled faintly of old wood and books, a scent that had always made her feel safe. Even in the loneliness of the years since her husband's death, she gently set the dog down on the old quilt she had used for years, a quilt her husband had once sewn for her. It was faded now, but the memories it held were still strong. As she moved to the kitchen to find a bowl of water, the dog curled up on the quilt, its eyes watching her closely. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched her with those big, fearful eyes. Eleanor could feel the tension in her chest. The weight of the decision was becoming heavier with every passing second. She had made the choice to rescue this dog, but now that it was in her home, the reality of what that meant was settling in. She had no idea how to take care of it. She wasn't sure what to feed it, how to make it feel safe, or if it even wanted her help. She had nothing to offer but her own uncertain presence. It felt like too much. But as she walked back into the living room, she stopped in her tracks. The dog had rolled onto its back, its paws stretched out awkwardly, and its eyes were half closed, as though it was starting to trust her just a little. The vulnerability in the small creature made Eleanor's heart soften. She felt an overwhelming urge to protect it, to nurture it, as if she could somehow fill the void in both of their lives with the warmth of her care. She took a seat on the floor next to the dog, her hands shaking as she reached out to gently scratch its head. It flinched at first, but then relaxed under her touch. A tiny sound, half a whimper, half a sigh, escaped the dog's lips. And in that moment, Eleanor knew something profound. This was no longer just about the dog. It was about her too. It was about the way she had shut herself off from the world, about how she had lost the ability to care for anything outside of herself. But now, with this dog, she had a chance to start over, to feel needed again. The dog shifted slightly, turning its head toward her, and for the first time, its eyes seemed less filled with fear and more with curiosity. Eleanor smiled softly, brushing her fingers through its fur. This was the beginning of something new. A new responsibility, yes, but also a new kind of bond. The kind that could heal, the kind that could transform both of them. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she didn't need to. All she knew was that she had made a choice. And that choice was to give to care, to open her heart again. As the dog closed its eyes, resting under her touch, Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a hope, a lightness, the beginning of something unexpected and, perhaps, something beautiful. Days passed, and the transformation in both Eleanor and the dog, whom she now called Charlie, was subtle but undeniable. Eleanor had always been a woman of routine. Everything in its place, everything measured. But now, with Charlie in her life, nothing felt quite as predictable. The quiet rhythm she had come to rely on had been disrupted, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but in a way that slowly began to rebuild her sense of purpose. She found herself waking up earlier each morning, her first thoughts not of the dull ache in her back or the silence that had once been all-consuming, but of Charlie. She had no idea how to properly care for him. But the more time she spent with him, the more she learned about his needs. He was still a little scared, still skittish around certain sounds, like the sharp clang of the kettle or the unexpected creak of the floorboards, but he was coming around. Every day, she watched as he grew more comfortable in her home, stretching out on the quilt she had laid for him, curling up in the spot where she used to sit, as though he had found a place of comfort in the chaos of his new life. Eleanor often sat beside him, watching him as he dozed, his body rising and falling gently with each breath. She ran her fingers through his fur, still too thin for her liking, and thought about how life had a way of surprising you. She had never expected to care for a dog. Never thought she had the capacity for it, not at her age, not after everything she had been through. But here, with this small creature that had entered her life in such an unexpected way, she found herself questioning the limitations she had placed on her own heart. Charlie wasn't the only one changing. Eleanor's heart, too, was softening. At first, she had been hesitant, afraid that loving the dog might lead her to feel the loss of her husband more sharply, that it might remind her of the ways she had closed herself off to avoid the pain of grief. But the more she cared for Charlie, the more she realized that opening herself up again didn't mean she was forgetting. It meant she was healing. In the quiet of the mornings, Eleanor began talking to Charlie as if he were a long-lost friend, confiding in him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to in years. She told him about her late husband, about how they had spent so many quiet evenings together, how he had promised her a dog, but the promise had remained unfulfilled. She spoke to Charlie of the things she had given up after his death, the laughter, the joy, the plans they had once made. And as she spoke, she realized she hadn't let herself talk about those things in so long. She hadn't allowed herself to feel that loss so openly, to grieve as she had once needed to. Charlie, for all his quietude, listened intently. She could feel it in the way his head tilted slightly when she spoke, the way his eyes never left hers, as though he understood her in a way no one else could. She didn't expect him to fix anything or offer words of comfort. He couldn't. But in his gaze, in his presence, there was something profound and unspoken understanding, a silent bond that was growing stronger each day. It wasn't just about the dog, though. As Eleanor tended to Charlie, she found herself tending to parts of her own heart she hadn't touched in years. She began to open up to the world outside her home once again. The isolation that had once wrapped itself around her like a tight cloak began to loosen, little by little. She started taking walks with Charlie through the park, at first only at dawn when the streets were empty, when no one could see her. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of, the pity of others, perhaps, or the judgment that sometimes comes with aging and solitude. But Charlie never judged. He simply walked by her side, his tail wagging, his energy infectious. It wasn't long before she noticed something that surprised her. People started to smile at her. At first, it was only small nods from passing neighbors. Then, as they saw her more often in the mornings, they began to speak to her. A few older women who walked their own dogs stopped to chat, commenting on how well Charlie looked. Eleanor found herself talking to strangers, something she had avoided for years, and it felt good. Charlie had opened a door, not just to the outside world, but to a part of her own soul that had been dormant for far too long. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat on a bench by the lake, watching Charlie chase a bird that fluttered just out of his reach, she realized how much he had changed her. The dog had come into her life unexpectedly, a silent, trembling creature she had been unsure of at first. But now, as she watched him run with abandon, her heart full of warmth, she knew that he had brought something back to her, a sense of wonder, a sense of life. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but Eleanor felt the change within herself. She had gone from being a woman who feared loneliness to someone who had learned to share her life with another living being, even if it was just a dog. She had learned to let go of the grip of isolation that had once controlled her, to open herself to the possibility of joy, even if it came in small, unexpected ways. And as Charlie returned to her side, his head held high, his eyes full of excitement, Eleanor reached down to stroke his fur. He had been lost, abandoned, a stray wandering through the rain. But now with her, he had found a home where he was loved, where he could be himself without fear. In return, he had given her something precious, the courage to love again, the courage to trust, to care, and to hope. Eleanor's mornings had changed. Where once she had awoken to the quiet emptiness of her house, now she woke to the soft sound of Charlie's paws padding across the floor, his tail thumping lightly against the side of the bed. The first few days of caring for him had been tentative, cautious, both of them learning to trust each other. But now, it was different. The house was no longer just a place she inhabited. It had become a home again, filled with the subtle sounds of life. A low whine when Charlie needed to go outside, the soft rustle of him chasing after his favorite ball, the rhythmic breathing of him sleeping beside her on the couch. Eleanor had learned to wake earlier than she used to, motivated by the small creature at her side, the feeling of being needed that had so long eluded her. It wasn't just the mornings. The afternoons, too, had begun to shift. Eleanor found herself taking longer walks with Charlie in the park, each step an invitation to explore the world again. At first, it had been something of an obligation, something to pass the time, to keep Charlie active. But now those walks had become something else entirely. They were a ritual, a shared experience between two beings who, in their own ways, had known loss and the ache of solitude. The park was a different place now. Eleanor had always passed it by on her way to the store, never pausing to take it in. The trees, the soft breeze, the children playing, it had all been background noise, just a part of the landscape she barely noticed. But with Charlie beside her, everything felt more alive. She found herself smiling at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She noticed the sound of birds chirping in the distance, the laughter of children echoing from the playground, the smell of fresh grass after the rain. It was as if the world was waking up around her, and for the first time in years, she was awake with it. Charlie had an enthusiasm for life that was infectious. He bounded ahead, chasing after squirrels or birds, and when he wasn't running, he'd trot back to her, eyes full of joy, as though reminding her that there was always something to look forward to, something to chase after. Eleanor couldn't help but laugh sometimes at his boundless energy, at the way he would get so caught up in his excitement that he'd forget where he was, his tail wagging so hard it seemed like it might fall off. It was in these moments that Eleanor truly understood what Charlie had brought into her life. It wasn't just about having a companion, though that was certainly part of it. It was about rediscovering the small wonders of the world, the things she had long overlooked. With Charlie, she was learning to look at life with fresh eyes, to appreciate the little things. The way the light shifted in the sky at dusk, the way the wind rustled through the leaves, the sound of laughter that reminded her she wasn't alone. But it wasn't just the world around her that was changing. Eleanor herself had started to change. She no longer spent her days in the quiet solitude she once cherished. She began to reach out to people again, to engage with her neighbors, to speak to the families in the park. It wasn't easy. The isolation she had built around herself was still there, a shadow that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. But Charlie had started to pull her out of it, gently, steadily. She had noticed it one afternoon when, after a long walk, a woman with a golden retriever had stopped to chat. Eleanor had always avoided such encounters before, preferring the company of her thoughts to the chatter of strangers. But now, as the woman smiled at Charlie and asked about him, Eleanor found herself responding, her voice light, friendly, something she hadn't heard in a long time. She wasn't entirely sure when it had happened, when she had gone from being a woman who walked through the world as an observer, disconnected and solitary, to someone who was actively engaging with it again. But Charlie had made it happen. He had given her the gift of companionship, not just in the literal sense, but in the emotional sense. He had made her feel like she was part of something again, and through him, she was reconnecting with the world, piece by piece. But the changes weren't just emotional. Eleanor's body, too, had begun to feel the difference. The stiffness in her joints that had once plagued her was starting to ease. She wasn't sure if it was the walks with Charlie or the fresh air, but she could feel a lightness in herself, a softness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She no longer felt the weight of her years as heavily as before. And even though she was still the same woman she had always been, older, slower, perhaps a little more fragile, she felt a renewed sense of strength. It was as though, by caring for Charlie, she was also taking better care of herself. As the weeks passed, Eleanor became more confident in her ability to care for Charlie. She learned his quirks, the way he would nudge her hand when he wanted attention, the way he would circle her legs when he was excited, the way he would sit quietly by the door when he needed to go outside. She found herself anticipating his needs without thinking, the way a mother might anticipate the needs of her child. And with each passing day, the bond between them deepened. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the sky painted with the soft hues of sunset, Eleanor looked down at Charlie, who was curled up by her feet. She stroked his fur gently, a small smile tugging at her lips. The world felt full in a way it hadn't for so long. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. In that moment, Eleanor realized something profound she had been afraid for so long, afraid of loving, afraid of being vulnerable. But Charlie had shown her something she had forgotten, that love didn't always have to come from grand gestures or great promises. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of a small dog who had found his way into her heart. And in loving him, she had found a way back to herself, to the part of her that had once known joy, known hope, known the simple pleasure of being needed. And so, with Charlie at her side, Eleanor took another step forward, one not just into the world around her, but into her own life again. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years she felt ready to face it. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the park. It was a late afternoon and the streets, still wet from the morning's rain, sparkled in the light as if the world itself had been washed clean. Eleanor sat on the same park bench she had claimed as her own for the past few weeks, her back resting against the cool wood, Charlie at her feet. His fur had grown shinier, the thinness she had once feared now replaced by a healthy coat. He sat beside her, his head resting on her lap, eyes closed, content to simply be in her presence. Eleanor watched the children playing in the distance, their laughter rising above the occasional chirps of birds hidden in the trees. She smiled, her eyes following a small group of kids chasing after a soccer ball, their carefree energy reminding her of something she hadn't thought about in years. The simple joy of play, of having no worries, of being so deeply immersed in the present moment that the world around you disappears. She had known that joy once when she was young, when life was full of possibilities and dreams were only limited by the imagination. But those days had felt so distant now, buried under the weight of adulthood, grief, and isolation. And yet today she felt it, that joy flickering like a light in her chest, warming her from the inside out. It was subtle, but it was real. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, truly laughed, without feeling some sense of obligation or hesitation. But with Charlie, life felt lighter. He had a way of seeing the world as if it was a great adventure, a place full of small miracles waiting to happen. He reminded her that even in the most ordinary moments, there was magic. It wasn't about grand gestures, but the small things, like the soft breeze rustling through the leaves, or the way the sun warmed her skin after the rain. She had come to look forward to these moments, to the simplicity of sitting on this bench with Charlie by her side, her heart full of peace. And the world, with all its noise and its demands, had begun to feel quieter. Charlie had shown her that there was still beauty in the everyday, that the moments between breaths, the quiet pauses in between the chaos, were the ones that mattered most. As Eleanor continued to watch the children, she felt a stir in her chest. It wasn't just the joy of the children's laughter, but the realization that she had become a part of something again. For so long, she had lived in isolation, cut off from the world outside. But now, she had a companion, someone who depended on her, someone who made her feel like she was part of something larger. She was no longer just a bystander to life. She was living it again. "Charlie," she whispered softly, as if to remind herself, "you've brought me back." The dog's tail gave a lazy thump against the bench, and Eleanor chuckled softly. He lifted his head, looking up at her, as though sensing the shift in her mood. His eyes, still wide and trusting, locked with hers. He didn't need words, didn't need to do anything except be there with her. That was enough. Eleanor smiled down at him, running her fingers through his fur. In a way, Charlie had saved her just as much as she had saved him. When she had found him, trembling in that alley, she hadn't known what she was doing. She had only known that she couldn't leave him there, alone in the rain. But now, she realized that it hadn't just been the dog that needed her. She had needed him too. The companionship, the unspoken bond between them, had given her a purpose she hadn't realized she had lost. He had broken down the walls she had spent so many years building around herself, and in doing so, he had freed her. Eleanor wasn't sure how or when the change had occurred, but it didn't matter. She had stopped counting the days since Charlie had come into her life. Time no longer felt like a constant reminder of what she had missed. It no longer felt like a weight pressing down on her, reminding her of what she had lost. Instead, she was beginning to understand that time was something to be lived, something to be experienced, even in the quiet moments between breaths. As Charlie stretched beside her, his eyes closing in contentment, Eleanor found herself thinking about the years she had spent alone. She had thought she was content, that the silence was all she needed, that her memories were enough. But now, with Charlie at her side, she realized how much more there was to life. She could still create new memories. She could still experience joy. She could still grow even in her later years. And there was something else, too, a realization that had slowly begun to take root in her heart. She didn't need to wait for something big to happen. She didn't need to have grand plans or aspirations. All she needed was right here, in this moment, on this park bench, with Charlie beside her. The world was full of small joys, small blessings, if only she was willing to see them. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The children's laughter began to fade as they were called home, their energy now replaced by the quiet murmur of evening. Eleanor stood slowly, stretching her legs, feeling a slight ache in her joints, a reminder of the years that had passed. But there was a lightness in her step now, a new sense of vitality she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this park months ago, cautious, closed off, afraid of what might happen if she let anyone or anything in. She was different now, stronger, more open. And as she turned to leave Charlie walking beside her, she realized that she wasn't just living for herself anymore. She was living for the both of them, for the small moments that made life beautiful, for the companionship they had found in each other. And with each step, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The world was still out there, waiting for her, full of unexpected joys, full of surprises, and she was ready to meet it one step at a time, with Charlie by her side. It was a quiet afternoon when Eleanor first noticed the shift. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden change, no sharp moment of realization. But as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the soft fall of autumn leaves swirling outside, she felt it. A slight tightness in her chest, a pull deep inside her. Charlie had always been by her side, and for months now he had been the constant in her life. She had come to rely on him in ways she hadn't even realized. He had become her companion, her friend, her reason to face the day. And yet, as she sat there, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin and the cool breeze from the open window, she was suddenly struck by the weight of what it meant to love him so deeply. She wasn't just taking care of him. She had opened her heart, and in doing so, she had allowed herself to feel the fullness of connection, the fullness of love. And now, for the first time, she was truly aware of the risk that came with it. It was the risk of loss. Eleanor had spent so many years avoiding attachment. She had closed herself off from the world, from people, from the possibility of loving again. The pain of losing her husband had been enough to convince her that it was safer to keep everyone at a distance. It had been easier to live in the quiet, in the solitude, where no one could hurt her. But Charlie had changed that. In a way, he had pulled her out of her shell, made her feel alive again, made her feel needed. And now, for the first time in years, she was realizing just how deeply she had allowed herself to care for him. The thought of losing him, of something happening to him, sent a pang of fear through her chest. It was a fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She had always been in control of her emotions, always the one who kept herself distant, safe from the chaos of grief. But now with Charlie, she had opened the floodgates. She had let him in, and with that, she had let herself become vulnerable again. It was as if a door had opened, and she could see the possibility of heartbreak on the other side. The fear of loss gripped her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. She had promised herself that she would never go through that kind of pain again, never feel the emptiness that had swallowed her when she lost her husband. But now, the idea of losing Charlie made that fear feel all too real. He had become so much more than just a dog to her. He had become her reason to hope, to smile, to wake up in the morning with something to look forward to. The next few days were filled with a quiet unease. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. She watched Charlie more closely, almost as if she were waiting for a sign, a warning. He was still as playful as ever, running around the yard, chasing after squirrels, his tail wagging in the breeze. But even in the midst of his joy, Eleanor couldn't shake the knot of worry tightening in her chest.
It wasn't until one evening, when she and Charlie were out for a walk, that the fear came crashing down. They had walked this route 100 times before, through the quiet neighborhood streets and into the park, where the trees lined the path like sentinels. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot, the evening sky tinged with the soft colors of dusk. Charlie was happily trotting ahead, his nose to the ground, exploring as he always did. But then, as they neared the intersection, it happened. A car, speeding around the corner, its headlights blinding in the gathering dark. Charlie didn't hear it coming. He was too caught up in his own world, too carefree, just like any dog would be. And before Eleanor could react, the car was upon them. "Charlie!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. She rushed forward, her heart in her throat, but the car had already swerved and passed. Charlie, startled, had jumped back onto the sidewalk, but not without a fright. Eleanor reached him in an instant, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her hands shaking as she gently placed them on his body to make sure he was all right. The dog was fine. He was startled, his fur ruffled but unharmed. Eleanor's hands, however, were not as steady. Her heart was racing, her body trembling from the shock of what had almost happened. She knelt down beside Charlie, pulling him close to her, hugging him tightly against her chest, not caring if anyone was watching. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Charlie." The fear she had been holding back for so long erupted all at once. The tears that had been building, the fear that she might lose him, poured out in an uncontrollable wave. She had never allowed herself to feel this vulnerable, this exposed, but now it was all crashing down on her. The thought of losing him, of losing the only thing in her life that had brought her back to herself, terrified her more than anything else in the world. And yet, as she held Charlie close, she realized something profound. She couldn't protect him from everything. She couldn't keep him safe from all the dangers of the world. But she could love him, and in doing so, she had given him something that no one could take away. She had given him a home, a life filled with care, with kindness, with a bond that was stronger than anything that might come their way. Charlie wiggled in her arms, as if to reassure her, and she pulled back, looking into his eyes. He was okay. He wasn't just okay, he was alive, and so was she. And in that moment, she knew that she could no longer live in fear of losing him. She couldn't control everything, but she could control how much love she gave him. And that, she realized, was enough. The evening faded into the night, and Eleanor walked home, Charlie trotting beside her. She felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. She didn't need to hold on to fear anymore. She didn't need to protect herself from the possibility of loss. The love she had for Charlie was worth the risk, worth the vulnerability, worth the chance of heartbreak. Because in loving him, she had opened herself up to the possibility of something much greater. Joy, connection, a life full of small, unexpected moments that could fill her heart in ways she never thought possible. As they reached home, Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to let go of the fear, ready to embrace the love, ready to live fully, without looking back. It had been weeks since that heart-stopping moment on the street, but the memory lingered in Eleanor's mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the image of the car speeding past them. It was the sense of helplessness that had gripped her when she thought she might lose Charlie. The bond between them, once tentative and fragile, had grown stronger. But it was also becoming more real, more painful. She couldn't help but feel a deep, growing attachment to him. She had promised herself that she would never let anyone, or anything, get close enough to hurt her again. But Charlie had broken down those walls, and with him, she had opened herself up in ways she never thought possible. And now, the thought of losing him, of being left alone again, felt like a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. But as the days passed, Eleanor began to realize something. Despite the fear, despite the vulnerability she had allowed herself to feel, there was a quiet strength in her connection with Charlie. It wasn't just about protecting him. It was about being there for him, sharing a life, a journey together. He needed her and she needed him. And no matter what happened, she would face it with him by her side. They were walking again just as they always did, but this time there was something different in the air. The world around them had changed, and so had she. There was a new energy in the way Eleanor moved through her life, a quiet confidence that had settled in her heart. She no longer felt the weight of her years or the heaviness of loneliness. In the presence of Charlie, she had rediscovered parts of herself that she had forgotten. Eleanor had learned to give herself the grace to let go of the past, to stop holding on to the grief and isolation that had once defined her. She no longer felt that constant ache, that nagging sense that she was missing something. Because in Charlie she had found what she had longed for: companionship, joy, and a love so simple and pure that it didn't need words. It wasn't just in the moments they shared together, though. It was in the way her entire perspective had shifted. She had stopped seeing the world as a place of loss and sorrow. Instead, she began to see it as a place filled with small joys, with tiny, beautiful moments that could easily go unnoticed if one wasn't paying attention. Like the way the light filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the ground, or the way the air smelled after it had rained, fresh and full of possibility. It was in the way Charlie's presence had filled her life with laughter again, with a lightness that had once seemed impossible. But the true change wasn't just in her heart. It was in the way the world around her responded. People noticed her more now. They smiled at her in the store, waved at her as she walked by. Neighbors who had once passed by without a word now stopped to chat, asking about Charlie, commenting on how healthy and happy he looked. Eleanor, once the quiet woman in the background, had become a part of something again. She wasn't just a figure in the corner anymore. She was a presence, someone whose life had intersected with theirs, whose kindness had reached out beyond her own small world. It wasn't always easy, though. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the fear would creep back in, when she would worry about what might happen if something went wrong, if Charlie got sick, or if the world became too much to bear. But in those moments, she found strength in their bond. She would look at him, with his loyal eyes and his playful spirit, and remember that she wasn't alone, and that was enough. One afternoon, as they were walking through the park, Eleanor sat down on the same bench they had claimed as their own. She watched Charlie chase after a squirrel, his excitement palpable, his little body bounding with energy. He was so full of life, so full of joy, and it filled her heart with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She had never expected to find such a deep connection with an animal, but now, as she watched him, she understood something fundamental: love wasn't something that had to be earned or measured. It was something that existed in the quiet moments, in the shared spaces between breaths, in the unspoken trust and the quiet companionship that passed between them. Charlie bounded back to her, panting and happy, and she laughed softly as he flopped down beside her on the bench. His presence, so warm and familiar, filled the space between them. She ran her fingers through his fur, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. It wasn't about the grand moments, the big changes, or the things she had once thought would make her life complete. It was about the simple, everyday moments, the ones that might have once passed unnoticed, the moments that came without warning, without expectation, and yet somehow filled her life with meaning. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that this connection with Charlie, this life they had built together, was everything she needed. She no longer feared the unknown, no longer feared the future, because with Charlie by her side, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. The ties that bound them were unbreakable. They were no longer two solitary souls wandering through the world. They were a pair, inseparable, a journey learning together and growing together. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the park with soft hues of pink and gold, Eleanor sat back, her heart full. She had no idea what the future would hold. But for the first time, it didn't matter. The world felt full, the air rich with possibility. And with Charlie by her side, she knew they would face whatever came together, step by step. Eleanor had always been a woman who planned. She liked order, routine, things that could be controlled. It was easier that way. The unpredictability of life had once felt like a threat she could never quite tame. She kept her world small and manageable, her days filled with the familiar. But since Charlie had entered her life, that world had expanded in ways she couldn't have imagined. And with every passing day, it felt less like a disruption and more like a gift. Their walks had become something of a sacred ritual. The streets they passed, the park where they often stopped to rest, the quiet corners of their neighborhood, all of it had begun to feel like home. It wasn't the kind of home she had once imagined. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping moments of dramatic change. But it was hers, nonetheless. One crisp morning, Eleanor stood by the window, watching as Charlie trotted around the yard. His fur had grown thicker, his gait steadier, and his eyes gleamed with the exuberance of a dog who had known both the weight of fear and the joy of being loved. He had come so far from the trembling creature she had found in the alley, and as she watched him now, she realized how much he had changed her too. Her house, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a space full of warmth. She had always believed she could survive on her own, that the silence could be her companion. But now, as she watched Charlie play, she understood that survival wasn't the same as living. And while the quiet might have once felt safe, it was no longer enough. She had found something new in herself, something that had been hidden for so long, an openness, a willingness to embrace life as it came, without the constant need for control. The phone call came that afternoon, just as Eleanor was preparing lunch. It was from her neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, the kind woman who had often waved from her porch, but whom Eleanor had never really spoken to until recently. Over the past few weeks, they had shared a few brief conversations, usually about Charlie, but today's call felt different. "Hello, Eleanor. It's Emma from next door." Mrs. Dawson's voice was warm, but there was an undertone of something that Eleanor couldn't quite place. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just calling to see if you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. It's my daughter's birthday, and she's coming over with the grandkids. It would be nice to have you." For a moment, Eleanor stood still. She hadn't been invited to a family dinner in years. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. The thought of sitting down with strangers, of sharing a meal, felt unfamiliar and intimidating. But then she looked down at Charlie, who had been waiting patiently by her side, his tail wagging expectantly. Maybe it was the warmth in Mrs. Dawson's voice, or maybe it was just the realization that she couldn't keep living in her self-imposed isolation. Either way, Eleanor felt a small spark of courage begin to rise within her. "I'd love to," she said, her voice steady but her heart beating faster than usual. "Thank you for inviting me." That evening, Eleanor dressed in the best clothes she had. It wasn't much, just a simple sweater and a pair of trousers, but it felt different this time. It felt like an invitation to step outside the boundaries she had set for herself, to open herself up to the possibility of connection. As she adjusted her scarf in front of the mirror, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection. She looked older, of course, the years etched into her face. But there was something else there too. A softness, a gentleness that had come with accepting the love Charlie had given her. When she arrived at Mrs. Dawson's house, she was greeted with a warmth that immediately put her at ease. The smell of roasting chicken and fresh, baked bread filled the air, and the sound of laughter from the children echoed in the living room. Eleanor stood for a moment at the doorway, taking it all in. This was what she had been missing. This was what she had been hiding from. The simple joy of being with others, sharing a meal, laughing together. Mrs. Dawson led her inside, and Eleanor was introduced to her daughter and grandchildren. They were kind, welcoming, and without hesitation, made space for her at the table. As they sat down, Eleanor couldn't help but notice how Charlie had become the focal point of the evening. The grandchildren loved him, and even the adults found themselves drawn to him, laughing as he pranced around with a toy in his mouth, clearly delighted by the attention. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a part of something. She wasn't just an observer anymore, watching from the sidelines of life. She was included. She was wanted. As she looked around the table, the warm faces of the people around her, the way the room buzzed with conversation and laughter, she realized how much she had missed this. The connection, the shared experiences, the simple act of being present. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself talking more than she had expected. She shared stories of her childhood, of her husband, of the early years of their marriage. She laughed, genuinely laughed, when the grandchildren told silly jokes, and she found herself offering advice to Mrs. Dawson's daughter, who was struggling to keep up with her energetic kids. By the time dessert was served, Eleanor felt like a different person. She felt full in a way that had nothing to do with the food, but everything to do with the people around her. She had allowed herself to be a part of something, to embrace the possibility of connection. And as she sat back in her chair, Charlie curled up at her feet, she realized that this was the road ahead. The road wasn't about avoiding pain or loss. It was about living fully, with all the risks and rewards that came with it. That night, as Eleanor walked back home, Charlie trotting happily beside her, she felt lighter. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for it. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Charlie, and she had herself, and that, she realized, was enough to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed that warm evening at Mrs. Dawson's house felt like a slow unfolding, a story that Eleanor never expected to find herself living. There was a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of her days now, a soft but persistent joy that had woven itself into the fabric of her life. Every morning when she awoke, Charlie was there, his soft eyes waiting for her to rise, his tail wagging gently as if to remind her that the day ahead was full of promise, no matter how small the moments might seem. It wasn't just about the walks anymore, though they were still her favorite time of day. It was the quiet mornings spent in the kitchen with Charlie at her feet, the days filled with mundane tasks that now seemed purposeful. The small acts of tending to her home and to Charlie had become rituals of love. She found herself humming while cleaning the windows, or laughing as Charlie tried to chase after a ball that had rolled too far. Even the old quilt she used to sit on now felt different. When she spread it out on the couch to fold, she felt its weight in a way she hadn't before. No longer just an object from her past, but a piece of the present, a symbol of the life she was building. Charlie had become more than just a dog to her. He was a reminder that life could still be filled with joy, even in its simplest forms. And it wasn't just about what Charlie gave to her. It was about what she had started giving to herself. She had opened her heart again, allowed herself to feel things she had once buried. And in return, life had given her a fullness she hadn't known she had been missing. A sense of connection to the world around her, to people, to moments. One crisp morning, as Eleanor sat at the table sipping her coffee, Charlie jumped up beside her, his head resting gently on her lap. She ran her fingers through his fur, the motion now so familiar, so comforting. There was something about the act of petting him, something so simple, that anchored her to the present, to the life she was living now. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore, or worrying about what might come in the future. For the first time in a long while, she was simply existing, content with the here and now. It was during those moments of quiet connection that Eleanor found herself thinking about the long journey she had taken. She thought back to the days before Charlie, when the silence in her life had felt unbearable. She had always told herself she was fine, that she didn't need anyone. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been afraid. Afraid of opening herself up, afraid of letting someone in only to lose them. The grief of losing her husband had shaped her life in ways she hadn't realized until now. It had made her pull away from the world, to shut herself off from the very thing that could have healed her, love. And yet, here she was, with Charlie by her side, having let herself love again, having let herself trust again. And the love she had for him was not the kind of love that was fragile or easily lost. It was steady, grounded in the day-to-day moments they shared. It was a love born from companionship, from the simple act of being there for each other, day after day. That afternoon, as they took their usual walk through the park, Eleanor found herself pausing to take in the scene around her. The park, once a place she passed by without a second thought, had become a sanctuary. The path they walked together had become a familiar one, each tree, each bench, each winding corner of the park a part of the life she was building. She breathed in the fresh air, the scent of damp earth, the lingering notes of fall in the air. The world around her felt rich with possibility, not because of grand opportunities, but because of the simple beauty of living. Charlie stopped to sniff a patch of grass, his nose twitching as he explored, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile. She had come to realize that there was beauty in the small, everyday moments, in the pauses between the business of life. It wasn't about waiting for something big to happen, some dramatic shift. It was about embracing the now. The conversations with neighbors, the way people smiled at her when they saw her walking with Charlie, the shared looks of understanding as they passed other dog owners. Those were the moments that made life feel full. She had been afraid once that she would never feel complete again, that she would always be living in the shadow of the past. But Charlie had shown her that even in the aftermath of loss, there was still room for new experiences, new joys. Life didn't end with grief, it was a cycle, a constant ebb and flow of connection, growth, and renewal. Eleanor and Charlie found a quiet spot on the grass, and she sat down, her back against the old oak tree that had stood in the park for decades. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the park. It was one of those moments when everything seemed to pause, when the world felt still, and Eleanor, for once, didn't feel the need to rush. She simply sat there, breathing in the cool evening air, with Charlie resting at her side. He looked up at her, his eyes full of trust, his tail wagging lazily, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. In that moment, everything felt perfect. Her heart felt full, not in the way she had imagined her life would be, with grand moments and accolades, but in the small, quiet ways that made a life meaningful. The love she had for Charlie, the companionship they shared, had brought her back to herself. It wasn't about finding the perfect answer or the perfect life. It was about embracing the imperfect beauty of what she had now. As the evening settled in, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above, Eleanor stood, her hand gently resting on Charlie's back. They walked back home together, their steps in sync, the bond between them stronger than ever. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt at peace with her life, at peace with the choices she had made. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid. She had found her way back to living, to loving, to being present in the small moments that made life worth living. With Charlie by her side, Eleanor knew that no matter what the future held, she would face it with an open heart, and that was enough. The first snowflakes of winter drifted from the sky, soft and delicate, like whispers of a world that had been holding its breath. Eleanor stood by the window, watching as the park outside was slowly blanketed in white. The world, once again, was being transformed. It felt like a return to something old and familiar, yet new and full of possibility. There was a quiet magic in the air, a peaceful stillness that seemed to match the calm that had settled within her. Charlie sat at her feet, looking up at her with his usual unspoken understanding. He had grown into a companion she could count on, not just for walks, for play, or for the comforting presence he offered, but for the simple, everyday reminders that life was meant to be lived fully, even in the smallest of moments. Eleanor ran her fingers through his fur, his warm body a gentle reminder of the love they had built together. She had learned so much from him, not just how to love again, but how to be open to the world, to embrace the unknown with a quiet strength that had always been there, but had taken her years to find. As the seasons had changed, so had she. From the tentative steps of their early days together to the comfortable rhythm they now shared, Eleanor felt that she had come full circle. She was no longer the woman who had retreated into the safety of solitude, avoiding life's messiness. She was no longer defined by her grief or by the emptiness that had once swallowed her whole. Now, with Charlie at her side, she was fully engaged in the world around her. The loneliness she had once feared had been replaced with something far more powerful: connection. It wasn't just Charlie who had taught her this lesson. It was the world itself, which she had learned to embrace with a sense of wonder, just as he embraced life with a childlike joy. Her walks through the park were no longer solitary excursions, but moments of reflection, moments of stillness, moments where the world revealed itself in ways she had never thought possible. The trees, the animals, the people around her, they were all part of the same story, the same beautiful, chaotic dance of life. Eleanor's relationship with the neighbors had deepened too. What had started as casual greetings had turned into real friendships. She had spent more time with Mrs. Dawson and her family, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. Her once quiet house now echoed with the sounds of visitors, of friends who had come to know her for who she truly was. Not the woman who hid behind closed doors, but the woman who was capable of so much more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. And yet, through it all, it was Charlie who remained her constant. He was the thread that had woven everything together, the one who had broken through the walls she had built around herself, the one who had taught her what it meant to truly live again. He was the companion she never knew she needed, the one who had unlocked a door in her heart that had been closed for far too long. As the evening wore on, Eleanor and Charlie sat together in the warmth of the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She thought about the life she had lived, the years spent in quiet isolation, the grief that had consumed her, the fear that had kept her from living fully. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had grown, and she realized that it wasn't just about the big moments. It wasn't about waiting for something extraordinary to happen. It was about embracing the ordinary, the small, the quiet moments that made life worth living. Charlie nudged her hand, his eyes warm and trusting, and she smiled down at him. She had found everything she had been looking for in him: love, companionship, joy, and the courage to face whatever came next. The road ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in a long time she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. Eleanor stood and walked over to the door, the snow falling gently outside. Charlie, always by her side, followed her. Together, they stepped out into the quiet, white world beyond the door, their footsteps leaving a trail in the fresh snow. As they walked, the silence between them felt full, not empty. It was a silence born from understanding, from a bond that was deep and unspoken. They walked through the park, past the trees now heavy with snow, and Eleanor felt a quiet peace settle over her. This was it. This was the life she had built, the one she had been so afraid to embrace. And now, with Charlie by her side, she knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The world, in all its quiet beauty, stretched out before them, full of potential. And as they walked together, Eleanor realized that the true meaning of living wasn't about grand achievements or perfect moments. It was about the simple act of being present, of being there for each other, of opening your heart to the world and allowing it to be a part of you. And with Charlie beside her, Eleanor knew that she could face whatever the future held. As they walked back home, Eleanor felt a sense of completion. The journey that had started in the alley, on a stormy night with a trembling dog, had come full circle. They had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, and in doing so, they had both found something far more important than they could have ever imagined: each other. And that was enough.